At Making Medicine, we're reporting on the headlines, not making medical recommendations. For personal health questions, always consult a doctor. Nothing in this episode constitutes investment, financial, or legal advice, and please consult your own advisors before making decisions. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Medicine podcast, where science, policy, and innovation meet. As always, I'm your host, John Stanford. This week, we're talking through the latest White House MFN deal, some shifts in cell and gene therapy, Biosecure in China with special guest John Guy, Incubate's policy director, and more. Let's get into the show. Once again, our top story this week is day 15 of the federal government shutdown, and we're beginning to see more and more impacts for our community. More specifically, a large number of layoffs at Health and Human Services, including the Trump administration issuing a reduction in force, or a RIF, notices to some 1,300 CDC employees during the government shutdown, labeling them non-essential. Soon after, however, hundreds of those termination notices were rescinded, over half according to sources, though roughly some 600 employees across CDC remain affected. So there's a lot of confusion at the CDC about who's in and who's out, and how long these RIFs will exist. Key units that were hit but then partially restored included the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report Team, the Epidemic Intelligence Services, also known as our disease detectives, and the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases. The government mentioned that coding errors caused many of the wrongful notices and that staff were never actually separated from the agency. But this all comes as a larger mass firing promised by OMB Director Russ Vought and the Trump administration, and a broader HHS reorganization plan spearheaded by Secretary RFK Jr. That initially proposed cutting around 10,000 jobs from HHS. So where these cuts fit in amid a shutdown and all the rhetoric out of the Trump administration about decreasing the size of the federal government has a lot of chaos and confusion about who's reporting to these offices, and for companies that work with them and for health agencies across the country, who they should be talking to. Then enter the courts. A federal judge has already issued a preliminary injunction ruling the HHS layoffs are unlawful. Beyond the CDC, earlier rounds of cuts earlier in the year eliminated thousands of roles at HHS, FDA, and the NIH, which has already caused a lot of turmoil in the industry. Some recent announcements from large manufacturers departing from cell therapy investments also caught our eye. Mainly Takeda and Novo Nordisk have stepped away from their cell therapy units, and we thought it might be a moment to think about where cell therapy currently stands. As many saw earlier this week, Novo announced a restructuring effort where it will stop working on its cell therapies and cut around 250 employees in the cell therapy space. That follows an announcement earlier this month by Takeda that it would also exit the cell therapy development space and let go of about 137 employees as part of the restructuring effort. This follows a string of bad news in the cell and gene therapy space over the year, and even last week on the show, in sharing thoughts about what we heard in Boston, we know the science and promise here is bringing a lot of hope to patients, but we haven't seemed to figure out the economics. Take, for instance, Bluebird Bio. One of the true pioneers in the gene therapy space was sold earlier this year to a private equity firm for less than $30 million, despite once being worth nearly $10 billion. Investments across cell and gene therapy space have been trending down over recent years, an 83% drop since 2021. In 2024, companies developing cell and gene editing products raised a little over $1 billion across nearly 40 venture rounds. In 2023, though, they had raised $3.5 billion. And in 2021, they had raised $8.2 billion across more than 120 deals. Now, certainly, the era of investment right now is hard across all modalities. And so we can't point to these numbers in a causal fashion. But it's certainly a tough time to be investing and to be raising in the cell and gene therapy space. As Peter Marks, former FDA CBER director, said, there are speed bumps, including scientific challenges, manufacturing difficulties, and real-world application of these therapies that need to be worked out. Cell and gene therapies offer incredible potential to treat and even cure diseases by addressing their root genetic causes. So I think we all have to hope that this pullback in investment is temporary, both for the opportunities it brings patients and to ensure U.S. leadership in this technology. We do know that China, for instance, is continuing to look to develop these new therapies where some of the economics and policies remain out of place. I think it's worth editorializing for a moment that cell and gene therapies have not gotten the broad policy direction out of Washington that says that they are ready to be invested in, brought to market, and have a clear path with manufacturing and reimbursement. It might be worthy for Congress and for the administration to invest their energies in that instead of pursuing back and forth policies around price controls. We're excited that we'll have a pretty special guest in the cell and gene therapy space on a future episode where we're going to dig deeper into these numbers and why there's still cause for hope for this important part of the industry. Also in the news this week is that manufacturer AstraZeneca entered into a deal with the White House. This follows on the big announcement out of Pfizer that they too had entered into a deal with the White House. AstraZeneca's included a pricing pledge that will offer Medicaid drug prices in the U.S. that are consistent with prices it offers in other major developed countries. For new drugs, AstraZeneca will launch them at a, quote, most favored nation price, that is, no higher than what it gives to other large markets. Similarly, they will get a 3-year reprieve on national security-related pharma tariffs that have been much talked about over the last couple weeks. AstraZeneca says it will give them time to reconfigure supply chains and manufacture in the U.S. for products sold domestically. So it sounds, and once again, we don't have all the details of these deals. We didn't see the dotted I's and crossed T's of the Pfizer deal, and we almost have less information about the AstraZeneca deal. But let's see what we can dig in to say how it's a little different from what we heard out of the Pfizer deal. First is in product scope. The specific drugs and discount amounts mentioned vary between the two agreements. AstraZeneca's deal, for instance, mentioned discounts of up to 80% for some of its chronic disease medications, including specific respiratory drugs. It seems like they were focused more on specific products than a blanket-wide cost-cutting that we saw with Pfizer. What's not known necessarily is just how much of that 80% is already built into discounts AZ is providing, not just the government, but other payers as well. Similarly, there was a slight difference in the scale of investment. The companies both have committed to investing in the U.S. Pfizer pledged to invest $70 billion. AstraZeneca is committed to a smaller, but still significant $50 billion investment. Time will tell if these two deals are a departure from the norm or if more are to come from the 17 companies that received letters from the White House back in July. Finally, just because the government is shut down does not mean that Congress isn't continuing to work through a number of bills. One of the biggest outstanding ones is the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. It is, quote, must-pass legislation, and it has been passed almost every year for the past 70 years. It effectively gives the Pentagon and a few other agencies their marching orders for the next year. But it's what's in the bill. It's a wide-ranging piece of legislation that goes far more than just giving instructions to the Pentagon. If the term Biosecure sounds familiar to you, here's a little bit of a refresher. Over the last couple years, and John will get into this in greater detail, a response to onshoring the U.S. drug development supply chain has been this idea of bringing more and more CRO, CDMO, and other drug development services to the United States. One of the main targets is certainly China, where a number of U.S. biotechs and U.S. pharma companies rely on companies over there to swiftly and cheaply explore the science behind an asset or a compound. Biosecure went a little dormant after causing quite a stir in recent years because its implementation was so challenging. How long and how much would it cost to onshore this? And do we have the workforce? Well, Biosecure didn't die. As all things in Washington, it's been hanging out, and it's found a home in a bill that's moving in Congress. And with that, let's get into some greater details with Incubate's Policy Director, John Guy. John, thanks for being on. Before we get into how it ended up in a defense bill, I want you to kind of maybe bring people up to speed on Biosecure, certainly a term we've thrown around on the podcast before. So let's start with what is Biosecure broadly?
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. So, Biosecure is legislation that implements federal government contracting, loan, and grant restrictions to biotech companies that do business with certain foreign adversaries, particularly some companies that are based in China.
Before we get into it being the same or different as the earlier version, is it fair to say that that China's the boogeyman here? That's really the focus of this effort? Or is that one of many countries that people were thinking of when they drafted this?
There are other countries that are considered, but really China is the main focus of this. And we'll get into a little bit about, certain provisions within this and past NDAAs that kind of tackle the threat of China specifically.
So let's start with how is it the same as the Biosecure we've talked about before in broad strokes?
Yeah, so generally there are a few provisions that carry over from Biosecure 1.0, I guess we can call it. First, it's banning agencies from buying or using biotech companies or using biotech from companies of concern. It's also banning federal contracts if the contractor or subcontractors are using that equipment or services on the contract. It's also blocking grants or loans that would buy or use those same equipment or services. And it's blocking grantees or borrowers from spending federal funds with vendors that are using those same equipment or services on federal work.
So similar to 1.0, it's comprehensive, I would say, in its reach. I mean, what you just laid out there they're thinking of all the ways you could get around it. It's not just the prime, it's the sub. It's not just grants, it's loans. It's not just borrowers, it's also grantees. So clearly they've drafted it pretty comprehensively. What stood out to you as different from 1.0 in this second version?
Yeah, so it actually addressed some of the key issues that were raised in Biosecure 1.0 last Congress, primarily over the naming of specific companies and over opportunities for companies to address any flags that are raised in the review process.
Two things there. So if I'm hearing it right, this was called the Wuxi bill, and there was a swift reaction to this. You're saying the names of those companies have been removed, and then did I hear you right? That a company has an opportunity to address some of this?
Yeah, that's right. Starting from the top there. So rather than naming specific companies, it actually establishes two different procedures for identifying companies of concern. First, it actually uses the Department of Defense 1260H list to identify specific companies of concern. And this 1260H list, I can share a link in the description. It's actually a roster of Chinese military companies operating directly or indirectly in the U.S. This list was established in the 2021 NDAA, and it's updated every year. Something interesting about this 1260H list is they actually don't receive the due process protections that are available to companies flagged through the second procedure.
John, I want you to say more about that because I don't think this is something that's been picked up in much media. So, break some news on the podcast. You're saying that in the bill, there is an opportunity almost to protest these decisions if you're in sort of this second entity criteria list, and so there is an avenue to kind of push back, I suppose, if the government makes this decision. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so this second process for identifying companies, it actually establishes a formal review process managed by OMB to identify any companies of concern. And those identification protocols, are focused on any companies that are subject to control of a foreign adversary, whether they involve or are involved in the manufacturing or distribution of a biotechnology equipment or service, and if they are a risk to the U.S. national security. However, those companies that are identified through this second process, they're actually offered an opportunity to submit information in opposition to the designation, including steps being taken to mitigate those concerns that are raised. So there's actual chances here where a company that is initially flagged can address those concerns and have that flag removed.
Certainly something you don't think of, sort of an appellate process around national security decisions. So I think that's a great call out and maybe something that'll be meaningful. And as we said, this bill's not moving on its own, as we would say in DC. It's found itself a vehicle, in this case, the defense bill. What are the next steps for Biosecure in this? Is this definitely going to become law, or are there other steps that need to happen?
Yeah, so the House and Senate are going to have to go to conference over their competing versions of NDAA. The House version did not include this version of Biosecure, but to be honest, I think given the broad bipartisan support for Biosecure, I think it's likely that we'll see some version of this included in the final legislative text.
That is a big swing and a big announcement of news here on the Making Medicine podcast that Biosecure is back. I think a lot of people had, we're focused on tariffs, we're focused on MFN. This was something that caused quite a stir and even some divide in the community. So we'll be watching that. But as you mentioned to me earlier, that's not all in the NDAA. That there's more here. Can you give us some of the other big hits that might impact the biotech community?
Yeah, it was really interesting. So NDAA also included that the establishment of a biotechnology management office within the Department of Defense. So the DoD must name a senior biotech lead within 90 days and launch a biotechnology management office within 120 days under the Deputy Secretary of Defense.
We've begun through the tariffs conversation and others to link sort of this concept of biosecurity. And we just talked about Biosecure. What is this DoD's office going to do?
Yeah, so the office is charged with executing the defense biotech strategy. It'll update acquisition policies to bring biotech into DoD programs. It's going to coordinate across government, industry, academia, and global allies. It's also going to work to streamline regulations in the biotech space, as well as run global tech assessments, seed regional innovation ecosystems, and it's actually going to look to map workforce gaps across the country. So there's a lot in there.
I know that workforce gap is going to be a huge one. I know when we had Kendall on from Mass Bio, and it's part of the Biosecure conversation, is just, do we have the workforce that can allow us to do all of this here in the US? One of the other things in your note that caught my eye on this, just great analysis, is there would also be integrating biotech scenarios into wargaming exercises. That's a pretty wide mandate, making sure we have the right workforce, but also all the way up to how biotech could be involved in much broader global conflict.
Yeah, definitely. It's, I think, a sign that Congress, DoD, and other agencies are really recognizing the true promise and threat of biotechnology in the future.
Well, we'll leave it there. This is not the last time our policy director here at Incubate, John Guy, will be on the show. This is his area of expertise. Thank you, John, for pouring through the Senate version of the NDA to find these two things and give us an update on them. I'm sure we'll have you back on to give us an update on Biosecure very soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That's all for this week's episode of the Making Medicine podcast. Thanks to John Guy, Incubate's policy director, for joining and sharing his thoughts on Biosecure and more. Do you have a thought or question about today's topics? Drop a comment and we'll feature it in next week's episode. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and follow us on LinkedIn, X, and Instagram using the links in the description. Thanks for listening, and as always, keep innovating.